The killing was a means to an end. That was the least satisfactory part. I didn't enjoy doing that. That's why I tried to create living zombies with uric acid and drill to the head, but it never worked. No, the killing was not the objective. I just wanted to have the person under my complete control, not having to consider their wishes and being able to keep them there as long as I wanted. Jeffrey Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, was one of the most prolific and disturbing criminals of the 20th century. Dahmer was thrown back into the spotlight with Netflix's hit original series Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, and Dahmer is immaculately portrayed by American Horror Stories actor Evan Peters. Just amazing performance. Disturbing show, amazing performance. This murderer, sex offender, and cannibal murdered 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dahmer was fascinated by death early on, obsessed with animal dissection that triggered an early paraphilia called splanchophilia. It's being aroused by the glistening surface of internal organs. Start with a little way too into dead animals, add in a troubled family life, and clearly a deviant sick mind. And this all led to a series of gruesome crimes involving rape, dismemberment, necrophilia, and cannibalism. Dahmer's childhood of neglect mixed with a recipe of borderline personality disorder and schizotypal personality disorder created a true monster. His arrest in 1991 and subsequent confession shocked the world, revealing the extent of such true depravity. Dahmer's crimes have had a lasting impact on culture and society, prompting discussions about mental health, the criminal justice system, especially in regards to the police's lack of effort for Black and LGBTQ victims, and the importance of early intervention. No matter how many times I hear this story, it remains so monstrous, almost impossibly so. I do not advise eating while listening to this episode. Let's hit the road and head up to the Midwest, the Rust Belt, on today's gory I Can Taste How This Story Smells edition of Highway to Hell. Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hell. My name is Monty. I'm a singer-songwriter, definitely not eating meat today, and I'll be your host. I'm sure you're already familiar with this story, and I'm hoping that I can make it new and exciting and maybe share some facts you didn't know. Again, Highway to Hell is a true crime and paranormal podcast, but this episode is graphic. Okay, just buckle up. I would advise not eating any steak or chili while you listen to this. I also apologize in advance for some dark humor. It's the only way that I can cope with some of these stories when I've spent so much time in them. And I have some special announcements coming up next week, so stay tuned for those. This episode is coming out a little later in the day than I would normally release. And the reality is that working 3 jobs, I just fell behind. And it was Father's Day this weekend. I lost my dad 8 years ago. And it was just one of those times that was extremely tough. And then yesterday on Tuesday, I was part of a memorial service for John Wysocki, which if you are a Stained fan, it was the drummer for Stained for a long time. And I was part of that charity show and was able to perform with the band Soil, super popular. 2001 was their big album when Scars came out. Really cool experience. The band was incredible, great players, very nice humans. The event was wonderful. It was, there were so many people from Nashville. I know John was really impactful to a lot of people, but it was just heavy. It was just heavy. It was hard. And what I thought was going to take around 3 to 4 hours of my day took 8 hours. So I just didn't have the time. So this is still going to come out on Wednesday. Happy Juneteenth. But it's just going to be a little bit later because, life kind of got in the way. And I'm still working on how do I manage personal training full-time, gigging full-time on the weekends, and then doing this, but this I keep because it is my creative outlet. It brings me a lot of joy. It gets my brain exercising in different ways that aren't just learning new songs. And in regards to performing with the band Soil, when I get that video, I will share it with you on my socials, which are Monte Mader, MonteMader. And as I mentioned, happy Juneteenth. If you're not familiar with the history of today, Juneteenth, which is also known as Freedom Day or Emancipation Day, commemorates the true end of slavery in the United States. It marks June 19th, 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and announced General Order No. 3, proclaiming the freedom for all enslaved people. Now, if you know your historical dates, this was 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863, but a lot of slaves had not been freed yet. Their owners were trying to make as much money off them as they could while they could. Juneteenth marks the end of that, and it's become a cultural celebration honoring African-American history, resilience, their achievements. It also serves as a reminder that prejudice and racism and hate did not end with the end of slavery, not by a long shot. And I challenge you today and this week to look up some Black history. I was 28 years old when I learned about the Tulsa Massacre, also known as the Tulsa Race Riot, that occurred from May 31st to June 1st of 1921 in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This was a prosperous area known as Black Wall Street. They had their own doctors, their own banks. They had everything. It was a very affluent African-American community, probably more than anywhere else in the country. And the violence against this neighborhood was sparked by an allegation that a young Black man named Dick Rowland had assaulted a white woman named Sarah Page. What had actually happened was he had stumbled while getting into an elevator. She was the elevator operator. He tripped. He reached out and touched her arm as he fell to break his fall. And they claimed that he assaulted her, which if he was going to assault a white woman, why would he do it in the middle of a busy building to an elevator operator who was within earshot of tons of people? Didn't happen. But it was enough for mobs of white residents and some that were deputized and armed by city officials to attack Black residences. They burned, demolished, and robbed 35 square blocks of neighborhood. The attack was sanctioned by the city and law enforcement of Tulsa, and the massacre resulted in the deaths of an estimated 300 African Americans, the destruction of over 1,000 homes, and a significant displacement of the Black community. And Black Wall Street, this affluent, successful area, people pulling themselves up, was completely demolished. I was 30 when I learned about the Tuskegee syphilis study. Between 1932 and 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service in Macon County, Georgia, ran an unethical medical study on 600 Black men. The study aimed to determine the natural progression of untreated syphilis. Of the participants, 399 had syphilis and 201 did not. The men were misled and told that they were receiving free health care to treat their syphilis, but in reality, they were not treated for syphilis even after penicillin was the discovered treatment in 1947. The men were allowed to slowly die from syphilis while medical staff documented what syphilis does to your body. Do you know what happens to your brain in advanced syphilis? It turns it into Swiss cheese. It erodes the nervous system, leading to mood changes, vision loss, loss of motor function, hallucinations, and death. The study was revealed in 1972 and, of course, led to public outrage and significant reform in research ethics and the establishment of more stringent guidelines to protect human subjects. Again, we don't learn these things so often. So today, this week, look up some things. Ask questions. Challenge your worldview. My goal with this podcast is to open the world up, which means we have to open our minds. We have to be open to the experiences of others and to learn an unwhitewashed history. And it's uncomfortable, but it's really important. Incidents like this are a big part of the reason I chose Dahmer for my Juneteenth episode. Beyond, the human morbid fascination with serial killers and the extremes of abnormal psychology, Dahmer's case raised a very serious dialogue about equal protection under the law, the 14th Amendment. Would Dahmer have gotten away with his crimes for so long if his victims weren't mostly gay Black men? Would police have taken Glenda Cleveland's calls and her reports about him more seriously if she wasn't a Black woman. As you'll see in this case, the police very much looked the other way in many of his crimes. He was given lenient sentences by judges as he continued to mess up and break the law. Some of the recorded tapes and what happened during trial is completely deplorable, but was widely accepted at the time. A child ended up being returned to Dahmer because the police didn't want to deal with a, quote, homosexual couple. It was recorded in their dispatch. They called dispatch after the incident and made homophobic jokes about it and how they needed to go shower because they were so dirty from being near them. It led to a 14-year-old's death. Anyways, put your snacks away. Let's road trip. We're going to start with briefly defining borderline personality disorder and schizotypal personality disorder. And then we're going to drive down our timeline, starting with who the Dahmers were, his parents and him, his early life, and then, of course, his crimes, arrest, and his death. First, let's talk about borderline personality disorder. So, borderline personality disorder is a mental health condition characterized by pervasive instability in your mood, behavior, self-image, and functioning. This instability often disrupts relationships and daily life. So common characteristics with someone with BPD is going to be emotional instability. Individuals with BPD can experience intense emotions, mood swings, and it can be triggered by interpersonal stressors, a breakup, a fight, parents getting divorced, things like that. They're also known to have extremely impulsive behaviors, excessive spending, unsafe sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, or binge eating. Distorted self-image. So this can be an unstable sense of self. This can show up in a few ways. It can show up in like a crippling self-esteem, an over-exaggerated sense of self, or massive pendulum swings between the two. And the problem with this is it can lead to changes in their goals, their values, their careers. They can never seem to pick a path. They have an intense fear of abandonment. They're very sensitive to rejection, real or perceived, and this fear can lead to frantic efforts to avoid being left alone. Relationships are often super intense and very unstable for people with BPD, swinging between the extremes of closeness and idealization to sudden and severe anger or dislike, which is known as splitting. So this is the kind of relationship where they meet and it's, oh my God, it's the love of my life. I've met my person. And then a couple months later, I can't stand him. We're breaking up. He or she's crazy. That, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that person has BPD, but it can show up as that symptom. Sufferers of BPD have chronic feelings of emptiness. They feel empty, bored. They struggle to find sense, purpose, and meaning. They also have intense and inappropriate anger. So these are ragers, oftentimes. It'll be in response to a perceived slight or an interpersonal conflict, but it's anger that's well above what should be the natural response. They tend to have paranoid thoughts or they dissociate. During periods of stress, individuals may experience paranoid thoughts, delusions. They feel detached from reality or from their own body. This dissociation can become so severe that people with severe BPD can experience trance-like phenomena where they're so far removed from their situation in their body that they kind of freeze. They literally can't function, and this can go on for periods of time. Treatment for BPD typically involves a combination of psychotherapy, medication, and support. Dialectical behavior therapy is particularly effective. It focuses on teaching coping skills to handle emotions, reduce self-destructive behavior, and improve their relationships. Medications can be prescribed to address specific symptoms like mood stabilizers and antidepressants. Famous criminals who had BPD are Eileen Wuornos, Jeffrey Dahmer, obviously, and while not officially diagnosed, they believe that Ted Bundy had it as well. Schizotypal personality disorder, or STBD, PD, is a mental health condition characterized by pervasive patterns of social and interpersonal deficits, whether those are cognitive, perceptual distortion, or eccentric behaviors. So these people are going to experience odd beliefs and magical thinking. They're going to believe in strange fantasies or get hyperfixated on certain, it can be conspiracy theories, or they can believe in telepathy or things like that. For Jeffrey Dahmer, he believed that he could make human zombies. He was very determined to do that. Number two, they have unusual perceptual experiences. So this can include illusions or sensing the presence of a force or a person that's not actually present. This can carry over into hallucinations. They experience paranoid or suspicious thoughts. They are constantly suspicious of others. They think people are out to get them, or an invisible force is out to get them. Schizotypal personality disorder is very closely related to schizophrenia. It's not necessarily schizophrenia, but the symptoms often overlap. So patients that have schizophrenia, they experience pretty dramatic delusions. Hearing voices is a common thing. They hallucinate. Schizotypal personality disorder experiences some of that, but often to a lesser degree. They have eccentric behaviors or appearances, and this might involve a particular way they talk or they dress or their mannerisms. For Jeffrey Dahmer, a lot of it revolved around his obsession with dissection, body parts, viscera, organ tissue, these very strange behaviors. They typically have super high social anxiety. They feel anxious in social situations. They don't know how to respond. They have difficulty with close relationships. So they run into this problem where they're lonely, they feel alone, but they don't know how to actually connect with people. And this because Jeff had both BPD and schizotypal, this really heightened his perceptions because he dealt so strongly with abandonment, but struggled to connect on any kind of real level with anyone. So it kind of elevated his feelings of loneliness. They often have inappropriate or constricted affect. So what this means is that they have inappropriate emotions for the situation. And this is limited in range and intensity, but it's someone who's making jokes during a funeral service. It's someone who's telling you a story about something really horrific and they're smiling. Like when someone's behaving in a way that you're like, this doesn't fit this situation at all, and it's really uncomfortable, it's that kind of behavior. And then lastly, they often exhibit odd speech. Their speech can be really vague, or it's super metaphorical, it's overly elaborate. And a lot of these symptoms can just come off as someone who's really socially awkward. But a lot of these symptoms at once can be indicative of this personality disorder. Again, some of the symptoms are really uncomfortable in close relationships. They have distortions of their environment and others, eccentric behavior, ideas of reference, which is incorrect interpretation of casual incidents. So this is someone will look at them and be like, that person was looking at me funny. That person's judging me. That person did this. They're threatening me. When really all that person was doing was fixing their contact lens. But it's that kind of inappropriate behavior. They have paranoid ideation. Again, many of these symptoms are very closely related to schizophrenia and paranoid schizophrenia. Famous criminals with schizotypal disorder include David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, who said that a demon and a dog named Sam told him to kill, and Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, which I need to get to Sacramento ASAP so that I can do an episode on him. It is one of the craziest stories I've ever heard. But Richard Chase truly believed with 100% certainty that he needed blood to survive. And when he was in various mental institutions, he would break out so that he could eat the heads off of birds. Like the man was certain. Many of these men will claim insanity because they're just sick, as in evil. Richard Chase was completely off his rocker. So now that we have a background of the actual mental conditions that Jeffrey Dahmer did later get diagnosed with, let's talk about his parents a little bit and then his early life. Lionel Herbert Dahmer was the father of Jeffrey Dahmer, was born on July 29th, 1936 in West Allis, Wisconsin. From a young age, Lionel exhibited a keen interest in science, which would later shape his career and his life path. His early years were marked by a diligent pursuit of academic excellence, and he was determined to carve out a successful future for himself. This young man was ambitious. His commitment to education led him to pursue a degree in chemistry, a field that truly fascinated him. Lionel earned a Master of Science degree from Marquette University in 1962 and a doctorate in chemistry from Iowa State in 1966. Very smart man. Very smart. He moved his then young family, wife Joyce and his sons Jeffrey and David, to Ohio and bought a home in 1968 on West Bath Road in the Bath Township. Lionel worked as a chemist for PPG Industries. This job paid the bills and was aligned with his interests, but while his career was a home run, his home life was not, and we'll see a lot more of that later. Jeff's mother, Joyce, was born on February 7th, 1936 in Columbus, Wisconsin. Her parents, Floyd and Lillian, were of German and Norwegian ancestry. Joyce's early life was marked by both ambition and a lot of struggle. She was bright and determined, traits that propelled her through a series of educational and professional endeavors. But unlike Lionel, Joyce's path was less defined by a single passion. She had a lot of various areas she wanted to succeed in. She was curious and creative. Joyce grew up in a household where she often felt overshadowed by her siblings. This feeling of being overlooked contributed to her developing a strong sense of independence and a desire to prove herself. She pursued a career as a teletype machine instructor, a position that required precision and technical skill. Her work was demanding, yet it provided her a sense of accomplishment and financial independence. However, Joyce's life was also marked by significant emotional and psychological challenges. She struggles with bouts of depression and anxiety, conditions that would later intensify and impact her family life. According to Lionel's memoir, she struggled with a prescription pill addiction while she was pregnant with Jeffrey. She struggled to maintain mental stability after his birth and struggled with severe postpartum depression. These mental health issues were exacerbated by the pressures of raising a family. Lionel would claim that she was a hypochondriac who suffered from depression and wouldn't hold Jeffrey because of the fear of germs. She wouldn't let anybody else hold him either. It seems highly unlikely considering that she would later go on to work with HIV and AIDS patients when they were considered untouchable. She worked with them until her death. Her mental health issues and suicide attempts are fairly well documented. And even she recognized the emotional volatility and her frequent need for medical attention created a strained and unstable home environment for her children. Mental health struggles would be the hallmark of her life, especially after Jeffrey's convictions. I'll go into more detail on those at the end of the episode. The poor woman was truly tormented by what he had done, and she hated that Lionel wrote a book to make money off of it. Lionel and Joyce married in the late 1950s, a union that would prove to be both passionate and tumultuous. Do you see the hallmarks of some of those mental health disorders we talked about? Yay, trauma bonding. The lows are so low that when you get to a high, it seems like euphoria. Their marriage was marked by a deep love, but also a lot of conflict. Joyce's mental health issues and Lionel's demanding career created a volatile dynamic. And despite their efforts to maintain a stable household, their relationship was characterized by frequent arguments and emotional distance. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, born on May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, did nothing to ease the volatility of his parents' marriage. In fact, it plummeted Joyce into severe postpartum depression, which made her more resentful of Lionel's long hours away. That, combined with her already fragile mental state, was a recipe for disaster. Based on all of my sources, it really does seem like Lionel was either working or in school and just was not around. He was known to be cold and distant to her when she would get emotional, which of course didn't help. And of course she's emotional because she's stressed by the time he is home. She tries to talk to him about it. He's upset. He's had, you know the conflict. You know the script. Yes, let's leave a mentally ill woman alone with 2 kids and think that the stress is going to make it better. Let's do that. From an early age, Jeffrey Dahmer exhibited behaviors that would later become ominous indicators of his future crimes. Initially, he was described as a happy, energetic child. Dahmer's demeanor drastically changed after he had a double hernia surgery at the age of 4. He went in being this bubbly, happy, energetic child, and he came out subdued, less interactive, quiet, maybe darker. We've talked about that before childhood abuse, combined with other warning signs, is a huge predictor of criminal behavior, specifically serial crime. In Dahmer's case, the childhood abuse took the form of neglect. In a Rutgers University study focused on Dahmer called Psychopathy and Neglect, research defined childhood neglect as the failure of a parent, guardian, or other caregiver to provide for a child's basic needs, which may consist of physical, medical, education, and/or emotional needs. Neglect of a child at a young age is especially traumatic to psychological development, as a child needs human interaction and touch in order to develop healthy social skills. A child who is neglected at a young age is also at an increased risk for antisocial traits, borderline personality disorders, and violent behaviors when he or she gets older. And much of that research comes from the Child Welfare Information Gateway in 2008. So if you have a little withdrawn boy who might have some brain damage from a surgery, or he has some mental health issues passed down from at least mom, Lionel may have had some too, we don't know, who is basically entirely neglected by his parents his whole life. They're too absorbed in their own lives, their own conflict. They don't touch him. They don't hold him. They don't spend time with him. This same child develops an obsession with death and dissection of animals, which is never addressed. In fact, it's encouraged at first. I'd be shocked, honestly, if his parents noticed it all. Like, I don't think that they paid enough attention to him to pick up on warning signs. In 1994, there was an interview with Stone Phillips, which is such a cool name. Jeffrey Dahmer told her that he had never had a real deep conversation with his father. The conversations he ever had were superficial. Lionel would later admit that he learned everything about his son's state of mind during the trial. He did not know his child. His mother also seemed completely shocked. Joyce Flint, or she would later go by Rocky Flint, claimed she never saw the warning signs and was never even informed of the issues with her son until the news of his arrest and the crimes began playing in the media. So some of this is true to a point. So she ignored him his whole childhood too. But when Dahmer was older and was getting into trouble, she was not privy to that information. Her husband and his new wife were not communicating with her because there was so much resentment after the divorce. He basically blocked her out. So she did tell the truth there where she didn't know about his escalation. She wasn't allowed to help. They were also shocked by his sexuality, or they pretended to be. So your homosexual, strange son, you didn't see any signs. Every single parent of a gay child I know is like, oh yeah, I knew. I knew when they were 5. I knew when they were 6. I knew when they were 9. They know. They pick up on it. These parents are like, oh my God, I didn't see anything. It's like, that's because you didn't see your son. And what they do to him later is truly like maddening. Now, do I think that they could have ever anticipated that Dahmer would do this? Of course not. Are they responsible? Absolutely not. He's responsible for his decisions and his choices. But there were early warning signs. He was clearly struggling. And his parents could not be bothered to take care of him in any way. They fed him, and that's it. Had they been attentive to him at all, there's a chance they could have intervened sooner and at the bare minimum, saved the life of his first victim. So Dahmer, again, began this young fascination with dead animals. He would collect roadkill and engage in these weird experiments. He would dissect the carcasses and preserve the remains in jars. This becomes super morbid based on what he does later. These activities, while disturbing, were largely dismissed by those around him as being a quirky little boy, rather than warning signs of, wow, this is weird. His father fueled Jeffrey's curiosity at first by teaching him how to bleach animal bones and dissolve flesh with chemicals. This would later become one of his signatures with his victims. These early experiences with death and dissection became the foundation for Dahmer's MO and established a lot of his sexual dysfunction and his very rare paraphilias. And if you're unfamiliar with the word paraphilia, it's a sexual obsession. So foot fetish is a paraphilia. So it's considered outside the norm to various degrees, but it's directly related to what makes a person aroused. For me, it's brown eyes. That's paraphilia for me. Growing up, Dahmer also witnessed a lot of physical violence between his parents. Now, this violence never extended to him, but their home was full of conflict and tumult. I don't know why I decided to use that word. That's a weird word to put there. But, so there was a lot of physical violence between his parents, not against him, but he's witnessing it from the time that he's 4. This is why no-fault divorce is so important. Lionel's, his parents were not aligned. They just weren't. And this is why it's so important that if you're in a relationship that is extremely toxic and it's damaging your children, even though someone hasn't attacked the other person or cheated, sometimes you just need to walk away. Sometimes for the sake of your children, you need to walk away. Lionel's career demands kept him away from home. Joyce's illness left her emotionally unavailable to her son. He's witnessing all of this conflict. There's no emotional support, and he feels isolated. and he feels alienated, which is totally normal considering his situation. But given the presence of his mental health disorders, start to create problems. And then again, there's always that element with serial killers and psychopaths of like, what switch is flipped in you that took this childhood that many people have had and made you turn into this? We don't know for sure. But also as he gets older, these dark fantasies start to show up and there's nobody to steer him. There's nobody he can have a conversation with. So what happens? That fantasy stays a secret. It stays in the dark. It festers. It gets darker and darker and more extreme. And then you act out. Dahmer attended Revere High School in Bath, Ohio, where the family had moved in 1966. He was an average student academically, but struggled to fit in socially. Again, these hallmark signs of these personality disorders. He's known for bizarre pranks, odd behavior, schizotypal. Dahmer's classmates often saw him as an outcast. Psychologists and criminologists think that the alcohol abuse he began to struggle with in high school was to cope with his loneliness and his budding homosexuality. He's hitting puberty. He starts to recognize he's gay. This is not a time in American history where you can be openly gay. I cannot imagine the conflict he must have felt. And again, he can't go talk to his parents. He has nobody he can speak to about this stuff. You can get killed openly admitting you're gay in the 60s. He began to drink regularly around the age of 13. Alcohol abuse again became a trademark of the rest of his life and played a key role in his later crimes, both in his consumption and how he would drug his victims. Starting from his high school days in Ohio, Dahmer's regular alcohol and drug use became apparent. He was perceived as a loner. He was unpredictable. He would drink in class. He would pop open a beer and drink in his high school classes. His behavior included a lot of practical jokes, and it was so distinctive that it became known as doing a Dahmer. Like, it was actually a phrase in the community because it was so eccentric. One of these pranks, which is actually kind of hilarious, was he wanted to sneak into as many club photos for the yearbook as he could, and he was really successful. And when a teacher found out, she smudged out all his face with permanent marker, but you can find these photos online. It's actually hilarious. It's a pretty good, like, no harm done prank. By the time Jeffrey Dahmer graduated from high school in 1978, he was fully entrenched in alcoholism. His parents were also getting divorced at the same time. After it was finalized, Lionel moved to a hotel after suing Joyce for divorce, alleging gross neglect, which is interesting coming from the person who was never home. I have a feeling the gross neglect was probably sexual. But again, they were just not aligned. He's never home. He's not helping take care of the kids. He's not helping raise the kids. He's not helping her. He's not there for her. She has mental health problems. So much mess. So much mess. But again, gross neglect, I feel like was probably in the bedroom because she probably resented and hated him because he was never around. His estranged wife then moves to Wisconsin with her younger son, David. So she moves with David and they leave Jeffrey behind. He is alone the entire summer of 1978. His entire family just abandoned him. Didn't make sure he had money for food. They literally left because here's what happened. Joyce had said she was going to take a trip for a couple weeks. Lionel didn't know that Joyce left. To Lionel's credit. I mean, he still never decided to check on his kids, but it shows how present he wasn't. But Joyce is like, I'm going to be gone for a couple weeks. She doesn't come back. Ever. She never comes back. And she took David with her. Talk about being a kid feeling like your parents don't love you. Like you are somehow less than, that they take your sibling and they don't take you. Lionel shows up months later to realize his son has been alone the whole time. Because again, Lionel was not a present father. He was barely a father at all. Doesn't call to check on his kids. Because if he had even called once a week, he would have known that Joyce was gone. I'm sorry, that enrages me. And I can only, again, being the monster that Dahmer was or became, he wasn't yet. I can only imagine how deeply hurtful, like devastatingly hurtful, that would have been as a teenager who already feels alone, who already feels like the amount, like that is such a huge and egregious level of a rejection. And I think, this is my opinion, couch detectiving here, there is a reason. I believe that this abandonment was Dahmer's trigger. And I believe that there's a reason that his first murder happened shortly after his parents abandoned him like this. Stephen Hicks, also 18, who was known by his family and friends to be extremely caring and adventurous, was hitchhiking to a rock show, which was super common practice back then. He wanted to see the rock band Pegasus and was picked up by Dahmer. Quick little side quest. I had never heard of this band, and I feel pretty well versed in 70s rock, like at least knowing who the bands are. And so I wanted to play you a clip because I've never heard of them. And there you have it. Now you have heard the band Pegasus, which is, to me kind of sounds pretty standard 70s rock. On June 18th, 1978, Dahmer picks up Stephen Hicks, invites him to his parents' house where he's living alone. After a night of drinking, as Stephen Hicks attempts to leave, Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks to death with a dumbbell, some sources say a barbell, and strangled him. Remember this detail for later. And also, again, horrific, right? But considering the abandonment trigger, it's like, oh, okay, I can see why him leaving would set him off. Not to kill him, but would make him upset. In a panic, the recent high school graduate dismembered the body, put it into trash bags, and decided to drive it to the dump. While driving to the dump, he gets pulled over for swerving because he's drunk with the body in his car. It's in the back seat. The police left him off with a warning, and he stored the body for 2 years before he disposed of it. Police found the remains buried at the property when they did the search in 1991 after his arrest. And in a highly unusual turn, I haven't seen this in many crime cases, Dahmer had a 9-year cooling off period. I think he was so terrified by the murder, not just that he had done it, but almost getting caught, that for a length of time, he just didn't, which is really unusual for lust killers, which is the category that Dahmer falls into. During this time, he joined the army. He was stationed in Germany, but was eventually discharged because of excessive drinking. He would later say that though he didn't kill, he always wanted to. He said there just wasn't an opportunity to fully express what I wanted to do. There was just not the physical opportunity to do it then. Dahmer returned to Ohio in September of 1981 after his discharge and briefly lived with his dad and stepmom. He was forced to leave and move in with his grandmother after being arrested for a drunken disorderly and given a suspended jail sentence. This would be the beginning of fairly light sentences for him until his final arrest. He was sent to his grandmother in Milwaukee because they were hoping she would be kind of a tempering influence on his behavior. It worked great. Yeah, that's sarcasm. In August of 1982, he was arrested for exposing himself in Wisconsin State Fair Park and was convicted and fined $50, which is around $165 today. Then he seems to have tried to reel in his behavior a bit, or at least not get caught. He was attending a lot of bathhouses, gay clubs, kind of engaging in strange behavior, but nothing criminal. And it wasn't until August of 1986 that he was charged again for disorderly conduct after masturbating in front of 2 young boys. Dahmer claimed that he was simply using the bathroom. But he was sentenced to 1 year probation and mandated counseling. Again, another light sentence for someone that already has a pattern. Around September 15th of 1987, Dahmer finally kills again. And it seems a lot of his crimes happen or escalate around this August and September trigger. And maybe it was associated with his parents abandoning him because it's all in the same date range. Or it was just every time of the year he would get that urge to kill the way that he did with Stephen Hicks. Stephen Tuomi, sources vary on his age, he was between 24 to 28, was a quiet and artistic young man from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and worked as a short order cook in Milwaukee. He and Dahmer met and they ended up in a hotel room together. Dahmer would claim he awoke the following morning with Tuomi's body lying dead next to him. Based on his later MOs, we can reasonably assume Tuomi had been drugged. Maybe Dahmer had taken drugs as well and then beat him to death. But Dahmer would claim no recollection of the murder and was never charged for this one because of lack of evidence. Dahmer took Stephen's body to his grandmother's house in a suitcase where he dismembered it and threw it in the trash. Grotesquely, he kept the head for another week before boiling it. Remember, he's been taught how to clean bones, and then he pulverized the skull the way he pulverized Stephen Hicks's bones. Dahmer's next victim, James Doxeter, again, the age range, 14 to 16 years old, and despite how young he was nearly 6 feet tall. He was athletic and the oldest of 4 children. Dahmer lured Doxeter into the basement by promising to pay him $50 for nude photos. This would become a common ploy he would use. Of course, that was not his intent. Dahmer attacked him, strangled him, and disposed of his body. 25-year-old Richard Guerrero was of Mexican descent and close to his mother and sister Janie. Janie would later tell reporters she immediately assumed he was dead when he went missing in March of 1988. Richard met Dahmer outside a gay bar on March 24th, 1988, and he went with him to Dahmer's grandmother's house where the Dahmer drugged him with sleeping pills before having sex with his unconscious body. Dahmer then dismembered him within 24 hours, but hiding his activity was becoming increasingly problematic. And I will mention, because race does play a role in his trial, that his victim, that James Doxeter, was of mixed descent. And moving forward, all of his victims will be either Southeast Asian or black men. In September of 1988, Dahmer's grandmother was fed up with the late-night male visitors and the stench growing in her basement and finally forced Dahmer to move out. Within literal days of getting his own apartment, Dahmer was arrested and charged with second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. He had lured 13-year-old Keeson Synthesomphone, who was from Laos originally, to his apartment, drugged and molested him before the boy escaped and went to the police. His father hired Jeffrey an attorney, but he did plead guilty and the sentencing was suspended until May of that year. Anthony Sears, 24, had just been promoted to manager at his job in Baker Street Square in Milwaukee. He planned to celebrate his recent promotion with his family over Easter, but when Easter rolled around, Anthony never showed up. He was an aspiring model who loved taking photos, obviously, and was last seen March 25th of 1989. Dahmer, fearing that his apartment would be under surveillance, had brought Sears to his grandmother's house. Again, he's living in an apartment, but he brings him back to grandma's anyway. And I'm sure under the guise of photos, and drugged and strangled him. This was his first kill that Dahmer kept trophies, preserving Sears' head and genitals that he kept in a wooden box. And here's the thing with this, because he uses this ploy over and over. I'll pay you $50 for nude photos, or I'll pay you money for photos. A lot of his victims were aspiring models. And I can tell you, as I started fashion modeling when I was a teenager, and man, there were times, I look back now because I was young and I was so stupid and naive. You get into dicey situations because these fucking gross ass men with cameras, and a lot of them are professional photographers, will get you in a situation, taking photos, doing whatever, and then it's, why don't we take some with your top off? Show me how confident you are. You seem confident with your body. They paint it as this empowering thing, when really what they're trying to fucking do is get nude pictures of minors and young women. It happens all the time. I'm not shocked at all that this ploy worked, because when you're a model or you're in the entertainment industry in general, you want so badly to succeed. And people tell you, you got to take risks, you got to do this, that you'll make these dumb choices when you're young. Which is why we hear about stories of young female musicians getting sexually molested by famous producers or famous record executives, because they get into these situations thinking this is their big break. This is how I'm going to get discovered. And then it's a man, it's a guy saying, hey, and it happens to young men too. You see this a lot with boys, young boys in particular. It's my big break. This person notices me, they discover me, and then all of a sudden it's, has anyone ever touched you? And it's, again, I'm just saying that to say, as someone who used to model, not shocked at this ploy, not shocked that it worked. May rolled around, and on the 23rd of May, Dahmer was sentenced to 12 months work release for his assault on Keeson. He sexually assaulted a minor, and he gets 12 months of work release. Again, these light sentences. He kept his job at Ambrosia Chocolate Factory and was required to register as a sex offender. After 10 months of work release, he was paroled and rented the now infamous apartment at 924 North 25th Street. Ricky Beeks, 33, worked as a prostitute under the alias of Raymond Smith. He had gone to Dahmer's apartment when Dahmer offered him $50 for sex. $50 seems to be the going rate for everything. Dahmer then strangled Beeks, took several Polaroid pictures of him in suggestive poses before dismembering him in the bathroom. He boiled the remains and dissolved them in a container of acid he kept in his bedroom, with the exception of the skull that he kept with Sears skulls. So now he's collecting skulls. He's collecting body parts, and he also keeps all of their IDs. The smell became so pungent that the neighbors complained, and Dahmer claimed that his fridge was broken and he was waiting for it to be fixed. So remember the name Glenda Cleveland, because she ends up being the neighbor who really tried to let people know that something pretty horrible was happening. And she was the first person that she reported the smell to the landlord, to the building administration. She called the cops about it. This was an ongoing problem for at least a year before he was arrested. June 14th, 1990 was the last day that Eddie Smith was seen alive. Also an aspiring model, he was presumably lured to Dahmer's apartment under that pretense of photos. And then what Dahmer would do is he would offer them a drink. He'd put drugs in it. Once they were drugged, he would do whatever he wanted to them. Dahmer attempted to preserve his body in the freezer for several months. Dahmer would later lament that he was upset when he disposed of the body because he was not able to keep any parts due to degradation from the freezer. And there's no clear timeline, but it was during these murders at this apartment that Dahmer began to eat parts of his victims. Nancy Glass interviewed Dahmer in 1993 and asked Dahmer why he started to do this. And she later reported that he said he chose to eat them because he wanted them to be part of him. He was so desperate, so desperately lonely, so ashamed of being gay. Miss Glass theorized that he had serious issues around bonding and abandonment, which seems pretty accurate, and believed ingesting his victims would mean they would never leave him. Ernest Miller, 22, was visiting his aunt in Milwaukee over the Labor Day weekend in 1990 when he met Dahmer outside a bookstore. Unlucky break. Dahmer seduced Miller, and the pair had sex before Dahmer drugged him and cut his throat. Dahmer kept Miller's biceps in the freezer, painted his skull, and bleached the skeleton. Corrine Miller, Ernest's grandmother, would later receive a phone call with a strange groaning voice, faintly saying, "Help, help, help." Ernest was last seen on September 3rd of 1990. September 24th, 1990, David C. Thomas, a proud father of a 2-year-old girl, was murdered by Dahmer after a chance meeting at Grand Avenue Mall. Dahmer would later confess to seeing Curtis Strouder, 17, waiting for the bus near Marquette University. Strouder, who had just lost a nursing assistant job, wanted to go to modeling school, and Dahmer lured him to his apartment by offering him money in exchange for nude photos. We have a young man who just lost his job. He has no income. He wants to be a model. It's a genius ploy. Dahmer took pictures of each step of Strouder's dismemberment after killing him and kept his skull as a trophy. He was murdered on February 18th, 1991. I almost made up a new month there. And poor Errol Lindsay. April 7th, 1991, the 19-year-old was a victim of Dahmer's escalating depravity. It's believed that Lindsay met Dahmer on his way to get a key duplicated at a key shop. Sources are unclear as to how Dahmer lured Errol. He doesn't seem to have want to be a model or even someone who would really speak to strangers. But Dahmer drugged him, drilled a hole into his head, and poured hydrochloric acid in it to try to put him into a zombie-like state. Shockingly, Lindsay woke up while this is happening, and then Dahmer strangled and dismembered him, and again kept the skull. And if you saw the show Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story on Netflix, you'll remember Anthony Tony Hughes. And his death seems extra tragic. Obviously, these are all just so incredibly awful. But Tony was this vivacious, loving deaf mute who met Dahmer at a nightclub. And the show depicts them as having a romantic relationship, Dahmer communicating with him in notes and sign language before the unfortunate night where he snaps and kills him. But sources differ. After his arrest, Dahmer claimed that the night of the murder was when he met Tony for the first time, but other witnesses will claim that they had seen them together several times in what seemed to be a romantic relationship. So you can make your own decision on that. Some reports say they knew each other. Others claim Dahmer used photographs ruse to lure him because Tony also wanted to model. FBI records state that Hugh's vertebrae and skull were recovered from Dahmer's apartment in the raid after his arrest. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you're like, did she just change clothes? I did. I had a hot date and I was not going to miss it, and I wasn't done recording because I'm somehow trying to work 3 jobs and have a social life. So I'm back in black lace and much heavier makeup. So do you remember Somsac Synthesomphone? That name, I've practiced it so many times. Synthesomphone. The boy that Dahmer molested? Well, listen, it gets worse. May 27th, 1991, Dahmer meets his younger brother, Conorak, who was 14. He would become Dahmer's youngest confirmed victim. And like with Errol Lindsay, Dahmer drilled a hole in his head, poured acid in. He would later again claim to be trying to make zombies who couldn't leave. Dahmer's neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, I mentioned her earlier, and her daughter, Sandra Smith, and her niece, Nicole Childress, alerted authorities of a disoriented, bleeding boy outside the building. Conorak had woken up after Dahmer had drilled a hole in his head and poured acid in and managed to get outside, was running around. He was incoherent. He didn't have the ability to speak or respond to questions, and he was naked. According to later court documents, Conorak was, quote, seen wandering dazed and naked on the corner of 25th and State in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And again, if you're watching on YouTube, the kitten next to me, this is Salem, who got out of the bedroom. He escaped. Police officers responded. Dahmer arrived shortly after the officers and convinced them that Conorak was his 19-year-old drunk lover, which is so fucked up because even if that were true, Conorak is like, rephrase, not if it were true. If you look at a picture of Conorak, he's very clearly a minor. Like, he looks 12 or 13. And even if he was 19, he's too young to drink. The officers ran no background check on Dahmer. They didn't ask Conorak for an ID. The lawsuit later filed by the family against the city of Milwaukee states, despite the vigorous protestations of several African Americans on scene, the officers and Dahmer led Conorak back to Dahmer's apartment, where the body of one of Dahmer's victims laid unnoticed in the adjoining room. So he still had a body in his bedroom. The police officers, Conorak and Dahmer, go back to the apartment. They kind of briefly look around. And by briefly, I mean they didn't look at shit. And the officers are like, okay, they're homosexual lovers, we're out. And they left this 14-year-old boy with a cannibal. Tony's body, remember Tony Hughes I just told you about, was in the next room on the floor. 30 minutes later, Conorak became Dahmer's 13th victim. So there were 3 officers involved. One was John Balserzak, Richard Porubkin, and Joseph Gabrish. They failed to do a background check, which would have shown that Dahmer was a registered sex offender. They didn't ask for Conorak's ID, which would have shown he was a minor. They didn't take him to the hospital when he was naked and physically unable to answer questions. They didn't search Dahmer's apartment. And listen, Conorak has a hole in his fucking head at this point, which is crazy. And then the police officers get in the car and they call dispatch, making homophobic jokes, including that they needed to come back to the station to shower the gay off. This was recorded and later used in lawsuits. Balserzak and Gabrish were fired, but eventually got their jobs back with back pay later. 100% deplorable. Matt Turner, 20 years old, met Dahmer on June 30th, 1991 at a bus stop following the Chicago Pride Parade. Dahmer again convinced the man to travel to Milwaukee to pose for photos. Once again at the apartment, Dahmer proceeded to drug, strangle, and dismember the young man who ran away from home to a Chicago halfway house a year before. Dahmer kept his head in the freezer and his torso in an acid-filled 57-gallon drum. Again, this was in the corner of his bedroom. Dahmer also placed Jeremiah Weinberg's 23-year-old torso in the 57-gallon drum and his head in the freezer after drilling a hole in his skull and pouring hot water in it. He was really convinced he could make this never-leaving zombie. Weinberger's fatal encounter with Dahmer occurred in Chicago, where people saw Weinberger leave the gay bar, Carol's Speakeasy, with an unidentified man believed to be Dahmer. The killer told authorities that the pair took a Greyhound bus from Chicago to Milwaukee to spend the weekend together at Dahmer's apartment, where they had oral sex on the first night. After Weinberger wanted to leave on the second day, Dahmer killed him. The date was July 5th, 1991. 23-year-old Oliver Lacey was an engaged father of a 2-year-old boy when Dahmer brought the man back to his apartment with the proposition of being paid to take photographs. Again, same thing with the pictures. After Lacey was drugged and strangled, Dahmer had anal sex with the man's body before keeping the heart in the freezer to eat later. This would later be confirmed with DNA testing. Dahmer also kept Lacey's head in the freezer. FBI documents show Lacey was identified by severed hands the Milwaukee Police Department retrieved from Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer also gave police officers the identification from Lacey, which he kept. He kept the IDs and photos of his victims as trophies. Dahmer's 17th and final victim was 25-year-old Joseph Braidhoft, a married father of 3 who had the unfortunate luck of waiting at the same bus stop that Dahmer got off on, before the deranged killer invited him back to his apartment. As a result, the last time Braidhoft was seen alive was on his way to a job interview on July 16, 1991. Dahmer drugged Braidhoft and strangled him with a strap before placing his torso in the drum and his head in the freezer. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was finally arrested on July 22, 1991. His last intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment and flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers. Edwards was able to lead officers back to Dahmer's apartment, where they encountered a horrifying scene. Upon entering, they found photographs of dismembered bodies and human remains, including severed heads and body parts stored in various states of preservation. The apartment also contained tools Dahmer had used to dismember his victims, along with a refrigerator and a freezer full of human flesh. Dahmer immediately confessed to the officers that he had killed 17 young men and boys, many of whom he lured into his apartment with promises of money or alcohol. His modus operandi included drugging, strangling, and performing sexual acts on his victims before dismembering them. Oof. The investigation confirmed that Dahmer had engaged in necrophilia and cannibalism. His trial began January 30th of 1992. Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder. The defense argued that Dahmer was driven by uncontrollable urges and was thus not responsible for his actions. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that Dahmer was aware of the wrongfulness of his actions, leading to the jury to reject the insanity plea. On February 17, 1992, Dahmer was found guilty and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, amounting to 957 years without the possibility of parole. He was incarcerated at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, and Dahmer maintained many of his eccentric behaviors while in prison. He was often solitary, spending a lot of time reading and drawing. His notoriety made him such a target among other inmates that he was initially kept in protective custody to ensure his safety. However, Dahmer liked to taunt others with his crimes and his disturbing comments about his past. He would sometimes make references to cannibalism. This behavior often provoked anger and resentment among those around him. Obviously, and this is why he did it. It was just to get a rise out of people. He also had a really strange, fan club, like the weird people that get obsessed with prisoners. I don't understand that. Dahmer was known to cut his food up into body part shapes and cover them with ketchup to imitate blood. Yee. One of the most significant changes in Dahmer's life in prison was his turn to Christianity, which is super common in serial killers, especially people sentenced to death row, life imprisonment. It's a super common thing, and the unfortunate part of it is that while I'm sure some of them are very genuine in trying to fix their ways, it's really hard to buy, considering that they've been prolific liars and manipulators their whole lives. And it's super convenient that they find religion once they're sentenced to life without parole. Anyways, in 1994, Dahmer was baptized by Roy Ratcliffe, a minister of the Church of Christ, after expressing a desire to be forgiven for his sins. Dahmer's conversion appeared sincere to those who interacted with him, and he regularly attended Bible study sessions and engaged in religious discussions. Let's have a little side quest conversation about Jeffrey Dahmer's baptism. Okay, so May 10th, 1994. It was the day that he was baptized. They brought in kind of this like isolated little tin pool for him to be baptized by this preacher in. On that exact same day, it was the same day that John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. So John Wayne Gacy is literally getting strapped to a table, getting ready to yell, "Kiss my ass." Those were his last words. While Jeffrey Dahmer is being baptized. And it was the day of a solar eclipse. How weird is that? I'm not saying it means anything, but that is freaking weird. Same day, it's an eclipse. Jeffrey Dahmer gets baptized. John Wayne Gacy gets executed. Crazy. That freaks me out. I want to conspiracy theory dive into that because that is freaky. Anyways. Following his baptism, Dahmer claimed to have found peace and sought redemption for his actions. He expressed remorse and a desire to make amends, even though he acknowledged that he could never undo the harm that he had caused. This newfound religiosity and apparent remorse were viewed skeptically by many, considering the extent of his crimes, and reasonably so. Because funny you found a conversion once you went to jail. Interesting. November 28th, 1994, Dahmer met his end. All hail Christopher motherfucking Scarver. He was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, another inmate, with a dumbbell in the prisoner's gymnasium. Exactly like how Dahmer killed his first victim. Now, if that's not a little bit of divine justice, I don't know what is. Scarver later claimed that God had instructed him to kill Dahmer, which, maybe, but he cited the serial killer's lack of remorse for his heinous crimes as motivation. Honestly, I think we should just let Chris slide on this one. Because, for real. Save the taxpayers some dollars. And that's actually something, this is totally personal opinion. I used to be a big supporter of the death penalty, and I think that in certain cases, we should still have it. Like, when you've got somebody who's like a Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy level of person, I think those people, you know what? It's not worth our time and our money. But on the punishment side of things, at least from my perspective, life in prison is such a worse punishment to me than death. The idea that I live in a cage for the rest of my life is way more torturous than you killing me. If me as a person, as an individual, was given the option, I'd be like, please just take me out. Because I can't live in the same building, the same room for the rest of my life. But interesting conversation for a different time. And once again, the Dahmer case prompted intense scrutiny of police practices in the criminal justice system, particularly concerning how Dahmer had managed to evade detection for so long. And it has led to changes in how authorities handle missing person reports and interact with marginalized communities such as people of color, and the LGBT community. It is common belief that Dahmer got away with his crimes for so long by targeting marginalized victims. Very similar to how, the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, in Washington, only targeted prostitutes. And because prostitutes are, again, one of these marginalized communities, their disappearances and their deaths were not taken as seriously. And these type of crime sprees really make us look and say, hey, is everyone entitled to equal protection under the law, or are they not? Now, time for today's highway highlights. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He struggled with a troubled childhood marked by neglect and lack of a stable family. His parents' tumultuous relationship and their eventual divorce had a profound impact on him, contributing to his sense of isolation and his early signs of disturbing behavior, also exacerbated by his mental health issues. His first murder happened in 1978. Shortly after graduating from high school, his first victim was Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker whom Dahmer lured to his house, bludgeoned with a dumbbell, and strangled before dismembering his body. Number 3, on July 22nd, 1991, Dahmer was arrested after Tracy Edwards escaped from his apartment and led police to the scene. The police discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, human remains, and evidence of cannibalism and necrophilia. It exposed the full extent of Dahmer's heinous acts and led to his immediate arrest. Number 4, trial and conviction. Dahmer's trial began on January 30th of 1992. He pleaded guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder. The court rejected his insanity plea, and on February 17th of 1992, he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years in prison. His trial was obviously attracting a lot of significant outrage and a lot of media attention. Number 5, Jeffrey Dahmer was murdered on November 28th, 1994 by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver at the Columbia Correctional Institution. Scarver attacked Dahmer with a dumbbell while they were performing work duties, ending Dahmer's life and closing the final chapter of his notorious existence. And that's it. That is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer and our interesting conversation on equal protection under the law and what does the 14th Amendment really mean. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We're going to jump into travel recommendations really quickly and then sign off. So Milwaukee. I'm going to talk about 3 kind of unique tourist destinations, 3 restaurants, and 3 cocktail bars, and 3 local places you can find great live music. Milwaukee is one of those cities that I feel like gets overlooked a lot. A lot of the Midwest and the Rust Belt does. But the first place I would recommend for Milwaukee is the Art Museum. It's got this beautiful, iconic winged design. If you're just an art lover, it's a great place to visit. It houses over 25,000 works of art, several centuries, several genres of art. There's a lot of German expressionism I remember seeing here. And don't miss the wings of the Quadretzi Pavilion. There's an opening and closing, and it's a spectacle that happens every day. So they do like a ceremony at a few times a day. It's worth seeing. Then there's a place. So there's an area in Wisconsin called the historic Third Ward. It's a super vibrant neighborhood. It's known for art galleries, trendy boutiques, eclectic restaurants. It's a historic district, but it also has the Milwaukee Public Market. And there's like local foods, local produce. You can take walking tours here. And there's some really beautifully restored buildings. It's a really cool historical area, if that's kind of your preference. And also not something I would normally go to, but the Harley-Davidson Museum. It's dedicated, obviously, to the history and the heritage of Harley-Davidson. The museum showcases over 450 motorcycles and has artifacts dating back to when the company first began. There's interactive exhibits. You can take photos with, it's called Serial Number 1. It's the oldest existing Harley-Davidson that we know of. And then restaurants. The first one I would recommend is called the Sanford. So again, I'm always going to recommend at least one fine dining experience. You know, if you're going to one of these places for a special event or you want to go out for a nice dinner, the Sanford is kind of inventive new American cuisine. And they've got the drive-in trio of chocolate desserts. Excuse me. What? I mean, like... I ask myself this question far too frequently. Is like, if I could make one food calorie-free and good for you, what would it be? And I still haven't answered that question, but chocolate's in the running. The drive-in trio is amazing. They also have a 7-course surprise tasting menu if you just kind of want to have an experience. Very amazing. Second restaurant is the La Merenda. It's in a Walker's Point, which is another neighborhood, and it's globally inspired like small plates, so think tapas, but locally sourced ingredients. This is a great date night restaurant, great wine restaurant. If you're a wino, that's what I meant to say, I'm sorry. You can be a wino and a whiner. You can be both. And again, this is kind of a more global experience. Obviously with the name, it like you think it's just Spanish. It's not. There's a little bit of variety here. It's pretty great. And then the third restaurant, which I almost didn't go to, but it kept popping up on lists, is called the Odd Duck, also in Walker's Point. It's a constantly changing menu. So it's shareable plates. So it's a little bit more family style. Again, global cuisine, but it's just like the menu changes so frequently. So you could go there a couple times a year and it's always going to be different. They have a pardina lentil crusted carrot and a suckling pig taco that is unbelievable. Like shockingly unbelievable. 10 out of 10 would recommend. And no matter when you go, the menu is immaculate and it changes. So you can always come back every time you're in Milwaukee and try it again. Let's talk about live music. So the Pabst Theater, which is one of the oldest and most ornate theaters in the United States, it's live performances, concerts, comedy shows, theater productions. It's very, very old. It's very European style. So if you like, quotation mark, cultured events, this is your place to go. My favorite place is called Shank Hall, which is hilarious to me. It's a staple in Milwaukee's live music scene. A lot of people talk to me about it. Shank Hall features an array of local and national acts. There's rock, there's blues, there's folk, there's jazz. It's a super intimate, close-up concert experience, which I love. That's my preference. Arena shows are great, especially when you're seeing an artist that is just so big. They're not going to be any place but an arena. But being in an intimate experience like this is just really, truly incredible. But my favorite venue for local musicians is called the Cactus Club. Super eclectic lineup, like very widely varying genres. But this is really about local musicians. Super energetic atmosphere. It's just a really great place to meet people that are from Milwaukee, support the local music scene. Because like really supporting live music is so much more about supporting the people that are trying to make it and the up and coming people than it is the arena shows. Like they don't need your money, so to speak. Beautiful place. And it's just a great place to discover bands. Like people would talk to me about bands they'd found because they just went to the Cactus Club. It's great. And last but certainly not least, because it's very important, cocktails, drinks. Bryant's Cocktail Club was established in 1938, and it's Milwaukee's oldest cocktail lounge. And this is one of those places, it's got, you already know what I'm going to say. It's got that speakeasy vibe. And there's a wide variety of classic and craft cocktails. It's cozy. It's warm. There's no menu. So for those of you that are familiar with Attaboy in both Nashville and New York, it's similar to that. The bartender comes over to you and they say, what kind of spirits do you like? What kind of flavors do you like? Do you like this? Do you like that? And then they build you a custom cocktail based on your preferences, which means that mine would have bourbon in it. The second bar I would recommend is called The Outsider. So this is on top of Kimpton Journeyman Hall. The Outsider offers like just beautiful views of the city. It's a really great like rooftop type of spot. Innovative cocktails. There's fire pits. I love fire pits. So there's fire pits because obviously Milwaukee gets cold. And so, but they have the fire pits. There's panoramic views and the drinks are really good, really creative, really cool spins on classic cocktails. And this place kind of surprised me. I went because it came up on a couple lists, was a little bit skeptical, but it's called At Random. So this is a retro cocktail lounge, and it is like traveling back in time. Vintage decor, classic cocktails. They're served in tiki mugs and other kind of like cheeky and fun presentations. Listen, it's very important. Sit down. Focus on what I'm about to tell you. They have ice cream cocktails. I'm going to say that again for you in my most sultry, sexy jazz voice. They have ice cream cocktails. And it is super important that you go get one because I'm fairly sure that my life changed. You're welcome. And that is our road trip, our long drive, if you will, in the life and the crimes and the death of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, and our little road trip to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Did I just say Wisconsin or Wisconsin? I meant Wisconsin. Wisconsin. Thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast. Thank you so much for your support, for the lovely emails and the messages that I get about these. Reminder that if you ever want to suggest a topic or a story, whether it's a true crime story or a paranormal topic, please message me on Instagram, either at Monty Mader, which is MonteMader, or at Highway to Hell Pod. So just pod. And let me know what you would like to hear about, or if there's an interesting story that I haven't heard of yet. My friend Lynn just sent me one about Montana, connecting me with people that I can go visit up there, a story I've never heard of. And I'm very excited. And thank you again so much for jumping in on today's episode of Highway to Hell.